Greetings from the People's Republic of Cork. Thanks to Simon and all the organizers for having me. Before I get to the focus of my paper today, let me say a word about the larger book project that I'm calling The Big Pill, Enlightenment Binaries and Black Musical Metaphysics. In that study, I demonstrate how black music is, in both idea and practice, a counter-metaphysics of the West. Building on Paul Gilroy's thesis that the Black Atlantic is a counterculture of modernity, and playing with Dr. Funkenstein's formulation, they say the bigger the headache, the bigger the pill, baby. Call me the big pill. This book considers black music as an alternative, restorative, and corrective to Eurocentric regimes of rationality, empiricism, logocentrism, and their standard-bearer, white supremacy. It makes a focused argument about the binary collapsing metaphysics of black music by bringing together the wide-ranging frames of disability studies, political economy, phenomenology, astrophysics, psychoanalysis, theology, and theories of embodiment. The book illustrates how black music works through and against 300 years of Enlightenment binaries, from mind, body, and form content to langue parole, and prophesies new developments in the physical sciences that are today calling into question our reliance on the binaries of particle wave, past future, and space-time. In so doing, it takes seriously the affective, embodied, and seemingly irrational claims of Afrofuturist artists, ranging from Sun Ra and Ishmael Reed to P-Funk and Janelle Monáe. It interrogates the metaphysical etymology of Nas, the Jizza, and Roots Manuva. It examines the performed illness of Craig Mack, Missy Elliott, and Jeru the Damaja, and it theorizes the soulcraft of black hardcore pioneers, Bad Brains, beyond the received frames of essentialism and anti-essentialism. Here's a chapter outline to give you some idea of what I'm up to. I begin with an introduction that builds continuities between central concepts in Afrodiasporic theory, concepts that overwhelmingly center on gaps, breaks, and joints, from Edouard Glissant and Stuart Hall to Skip Gates, Brent Edwards, and Fred Moten. I then track the historical discourses around black music as alternately virus, disease, and cure in Chapter 1, before examining hip-hop discourses of illness as more metaphysics than metaphor in Chapter 2. Chapter 3 takes a Lacanian and Fanonian approach to untangle the Borromean knot of Janelle Monáe's black feminist post-humanism. Chapter 4 examines the hip-hop metaphysics of words as weapons, again examining black musical practice beyond metaphor. And finally, Chapter 5 unmoors musical soul from its essentializing discourses through an examination of Bad Brain's image of soulcraft, before concluding with a reconsideration of Samuel Floyd's work on black musical power through the frame of quantum physics. Which brings us to today's talk. The 1989 album, Quickness, by Washington D.C.'s unique yet highly influential hardcore-punk-reggae band, Bad Brains, begins with a vocal performance that both prefigures and rehearses the massive and distorted opening guitar riff that starts the track in earnest. This is the excerpt we heard at the beginning. We'll listen to it again in a minute. Famously, the group's lead singer, screamer, crooner, whiner, and growler is listed not as vocals or lyrics in album liner notes, but simply as throat. This paper focuses on HR's throat and Dr. No's guitar, both as instruments and instrumentalising human resources. In doing so, it places the sonic materialities of timbre, groove, and form as the focus of analysis, suggesting that HR and the other members of Bad Brains are both building and engaging in forms of musical soulcraft, the title of the opening track. On this and the tracks that follow, Voyage into Infinity, The Messengers, and With the Quickness, Bad Brains fashion musical vessels to convey their Rasta overstanding. Notably, they fashion these crafts, make these voyages, and deliver these messages through HR's highly cultivated growls, squeals, and velvety-toned lyricism, as much as through the band's technical mastery of their instruments, ranging from lightning-fast virtuosic solos to the rhythmic, metric, and formal complexities that would come to define the genre that they were instrumental in developing, hardcore. In this paper, I argue that this technical mastery is a second covalence of craft on the album. Furthermore, I suggest that this musicality is given sonic and rhetorical force through the recurrent theme of quickness, which serves as something of an idée fixe throughout the album in both lyric and musical performance. While quickness implies the speed, nimbleness, and craft of the musicianship displayed on the album, I'll argue that the term also gestures to spiritual consciousness, and most importantly, capacity for change, or growth, the ultimate human resource. Indeed, in the context of the album's Rasta episteme and Coptic biblical lexicon, quickness refers to life, as for instance in the memorable construction from 2 Timothy, the quick and the dead. As Bad Brain's double signification of the term craft implies, music is both process and product, both a time-staking artistic praxis and a vessel that moves us. Taking my cue from the band's original name, Mind Power, I show in this paper how their sonic praxis is evidence of a metaphysics wherein music is conceived as both an embodied spiritual practice and an instrument to be deployed in the service of humanity. Time and again on the album, technical mastery, musical variation, and the ability to change course are offered as sonic evidence of, in the album's opening words, life and creation. Taking up Paul Gilroy's suggestion that we might, quote, use music as a model to break the deadlock between the two unsatisfactory positions that have dominated recent discussion of black cultural politics, the essentialist and anti-essentialist positions, I read Bad Brain's hardcore and soul essences instead as dynamic unities, which I argue is an anti-essentialists, or more simply, human, reading. Gilroy, in fact, mentions Bad Brains by name in this foundational discussion, using the band as an example of the type of genre-blending hybrid that is an anti-essentialist's dream come true, a black punk rock group. So let me be clear. Mine is not an all lives matter argument. Instead of offering up Bad Brains as proof positive that we can all be whoever we want to be, or some other bullshit like that, what I'm doing here is offering up proof that their ideological, spiritual, and musical work, their soul craft, is part of what in hip-hop studies we'd call a KOS quest, a search for knowledge of self, that views essence as a journey as much as it does a destination. Indeed, thinking about this in recent months has brought me to the conclusion that Black Lives Matter is itself a perfect example of an anti-essentialist movement, a movement and a form of cultural praxis that recognizes the banality of universal platitudes in the face of particular and pressing crises. Before I get too far along, I need to get some more Bad Brains in our ears to sonify what I'm talking about. I'm going to play a lot of music today, and my hope is that you can all help me build and elaborate this argument that centers around musical practice and spiritual ways of knowing and being. I specialize in Afro-diasporic musics as both scholar and performer, and I'm knee-deep in hip-hop consciousness, which is, of course, deeply indebted to Rasta overstanding. But I'd appreciate feedback from you all in affirming or redirecting as necessary, as reggae hasn't been a primary research focus for me. For those of you who haven't heard any Bad Brains yet, their musical practice will, in most cases, bear little resemblance to what we might expect to hear from a band that praises Jah, speaks of rhythms, and checks for one drop, while laying down massive distorted riffs and flying off on guitar solos that call to mind Yngwie Malmsteen more than Bob Marley and Gregory Isaacs. But in fact, today I want to keep this rupture open, struggling with the cognitive dissonance between lyric, image, and sound, and ultimately think more broadly about the complicated ways that musical genre both encodes and engenders cultural affiliations. Today, I'll introduce you to the first 5 tracks of the album, highlighting a particular musical craft at play in each. In the first, Soulcraft, I want you to focus on the vocal performance of the guitar riff that we heard earlier, and then listen to their metric work, creating long phrases of looped riffs and juxtaposing them with shorter cyclicities, including the notably odd and ill one-beat gesture at the end of the chorus.
So my dear man, I'm gonna have you right, because I'm gonna have to pay. People direction in this unity, jump on the vital kid, but not the silent, yeah!
This mixed meter approach put the brains at the forefront of the hardcore punk movement, which stressed groove and musical complexity over the DIY simplicity of a previous punk rock ethos. The next excerpt I want to play for you comes from Voyage into Infinity, a track that takes the soulcraft on a voyage to the beyond, where there is, notably, no double sign, an important gesture for the book's larger argument about Enlightenment binaries and black music's binary collapsing metaphysics. In this case, I want us to focus on the timbral transformation of HR's voice, though it will also be helpful to listen for the wide array of tone colors that guitarist Dr. No gets out of his instrument in this and the tracks that follow. Listen here for HR's transformation on the repeated "oh no" as he moves from his rich vibrato-laden baritone to the nails and battery acid voice that critic Mark Prindle describes.
On this voyage to infinity, don't forget to take your soul. As a port, you'll find no double sign. Oh no, 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 no. It feels like I don't know. Come on, his light will shine forever and ever. That's right. It feels so good. Rasta's not no lie.
The third excerpt comes from The Messengers and features the Brains' early signature, speed, a feature that earned them the reputation as the progenitors of the hardcore punk subgenre. Again, note also the eastward valence of a continuing voyage and the vocal range, from vast spatializing growls to piercing shrieks.
The messenger, last but not least, the message was a
The fourth and penultimate musical example I want us to look at is the title track, With the Quickness, a track that I want to center around the virtuosity of Dr. No's guitar solo. In particular, listen to how HR prepares the solo with the line, "This alarm will open up your arms." As we'll see, like the previous gestures to musical quickness, be they metric, timbral, or with regard to tempo, this gesture is offered both as evidence of the band's consciousness and projected as an instrument that might help their audience out of sleep, an alarm that might open arms, or minds. Indeed, this opens up directly onto the musical metaphysics that are the focus of this paper. So here we have a great example of virtuosic guitar playing that's evidence of Dr. No's musical craft and the band's creative agencies. But I want to point out that it is also fashioned as a vessel that might reach the listener and have some effect thereupon. In short, it is a thing, as we'll see in a second. I also wanted to point out that we often think of such instrumental virtuosity in popular music, especially with regard to the guitar. But here I wanted to stop and highlight how HR's vocals are also evidence of virtuosity, a timbrally diverse style defined and discussed as virtuosic only later, when Mike Patton of Faith No More and Mr. Bungle fame started collaborating with another stylebender, John Zorn. Of course, speaking of Zorn, an even more notable aspect of this excerpt is its lyrical description of genre hybridization. Indeed, the song tracks lineages of black music's changing same from hip-hop back to bebop, from DC's go-go funk to one-drop reggae, from disco and acid rock to their realm of hybrid black hardcore. As H.R. puts it, they are all mashed up here in the music. The passage recalls the foundational essentializing arguments of Amiri Baraka's black music from over 50 years ago. While Baraka is rather subtle and deliberate in blues people, here his black nationalism is in full bloom, and Africa looms large. He writes, "Black music is African in origin, African-American in its totality, and its various forms, especially the vocal, show just how the African impulses were redistributed in its expression." Finally, he draws the nationalist frame and tells us, point blank, the song and the people is the same. Of course, my point in gesturing to this continuity between Baraka's naturalizing essence and Bad Brains' mashup is to show how much has changed, how Bad Brains' anti-essence finds its power not in the naturalized continuity of the black voice, but in instrumentalized musicality and technical development of voice, not in soul per se, but in soul craft. In a stunning switch of codes, on the next track, Gene Machine, H.R. moves from describing genre mashups to railing against scientifically created, genetically manipulated humans. Most startlingly, this pivot from genre to genetics is replete with a resignification of the term one drop, mentioned in the last genre lineage, a diasporic doubling that cuts across the Jamaican and the American, from the foundational one-drop rhythm of reggae to the bedrock of American racial ideology, the one-drop rule. Notably, where the one-drop rhythm identifies an absence, the downbeat one is dropped, left out, in the reggae beat. The one-drop rule identifies a presence, a drop of blood. Of course, racially coded as an impurity in American racial metaphysics. True to form, Bad Brains don't just tell us about this continuity between genre and genetics, they perform the genre switch for us. As we'll hear halfway through this excerpt, Gene Machine marks an arrival on the album in which the lyrical and spiritual match, quote-unquote, the musical. Indeed, here we have our first sonically identifiable reggae section.
Never know why when you see her. Quite aware, mistaken identity. Oh, machine.
With this sonic craft now in our ears, I want to turn and flesh out the metaphysical argument with a brief discussion of the band's history to establish some of the ideological and epistemic underpinnings behind the metaphysics at play in Bad Brains' musical praxis. Indeed, this gets us back to the book's larger metaphysical argument. In short, central to the band's ideology is the idea of PMA, or positive mental attitude, that, in fact, gave life to Bad Brains' original band name, Mind Power. The name Bad Brains thus plays on an inversion of the word bad, in other words, not bad meaning bad, but bad meaning good. But here the meaning isn't simply good brains, but rather brains that are so good that they're bad. Here's the relevant clip on PMA and its influence from the 2012 documentary, A Band in D.C. The clip shows a performance of what PMA looked and sounded like in 1986 or so, before tracking the ideology's development and including the voices of other influential hardcore artists who drew inspiration from the Brains, including Ian MacKaye, Henry Rollins, and others in the doc. Most fascinating, however, is the way that this clip lays bare the fact that this worldview was inspired not only by Rastafari and biblical mysticism, but from an early self-help book, Napoleon Hill's 1937, Think and Grow Rich.
Don't care what you may say. got that attitude. Don't get what you may do. We got that attitude. We got that BMA. We got that BMA.
I got into a conversation with my dad one day, and he said, you know what, I think I'm going to share something with you. Why don't you go read a book? And he gives me this book, and I see it, and it says, Think and Grow Rich. And it made sense, you know, to stay positive, not to worry. And it would show how people who refrain from living violently will get a good response.
Bad Brains were running this PMA thing, and their whole thing was that music should mean something, but it should also have a message to the audience, which pushes the audience as part of the thing. And that had an enormous effect on us. Have a positive mental attitude, go out there and do what you have to do, and make it work. And if you do it, it will work.
The punk music in England was informative, but it was more like, you know, fuck this, fuck that. We wanted to try to give an alternative and unify the people. And yes, we can make a change if we unify, as opposed to just saying, you know, this is screwed up and that's screwed up, and that's just the way it is. I think that was the difference initially in our message. And, you know, just being positive as opposed to destructive.
Like everywhere else, like punk rock was like connected to nihilism, like set to destruction. And actually, we heard PMA sort of saying, like we're making something, we're building something.
So here's where I am now with this project. As I say, I'm interested in this music and these ideas, and this music as ideas, as part of a larger project on black music as a counter-metaphysics of the West, a metaphysics of overstanding, wherein we can understand metaphors, for example, as something more than metaphorical, and a metaphysics wherein we can begin to think of thoughts as things, wherein we can begin to break down some of the entrenched binaries and received frames of post-Enlightenment thought. One way forward with this larger project is a set of continuities between Carolyn Abate and Homi Bhabha's work on the Barthesian voice, a voice that's not phonological but phonetic, not a meaning voice but an embodying voice. Notably, the oft-cited Barth passage that Abate quotes in her Invoicing article also centers on the frames of phenotypes and genotypes. Barth writes, "Writing aloud is not expressive. It leaves expression to the phenotext, to the regular code of communication. It belongs to the genotext, to significance. It is carried not by dramatic inflections, subtle stresses, sympathetic accents, but by the grain of the voice, which is an erotic mixture of timbre and language, and can therefore also be, along with diction, the substance of an art, the art of guiding one's body, whence its importance in Far Eastern theaters." Of course, while the attention to sonic substance is a much-needed one in our studies of voice, the danger in this reification of the discrete realms of pheno and genotexts is its essentialization of the body. Homi Bhabha's use of Barth in Location of Culture, on the other hand, gestures to a potentially more open and productive model. He writes, "In Barth's The Pleasure of the Text, I find a subtle suggestion that beyond theory, you do not simply encounter its opposition, theory-practice, but an outside that places the articulation of the two, theory and practice, language and politics, in a productive relation similar to Derrida's notion of supplementarity. Quote, a non-dialectical middle, a structure of jointed predication, which cannot itself be comprehended by the predicates it distributes. Not that this ability shows a lack of power, rather this inability is constructive, constitutive, of the very possibility of the logic of identity." Bhabha continues, "At this point, Barth writes, all linguistics that gives an exorbitant dignity to predictive syntax fell away. In its wake, it becomes possible to subvert the power of completion which defines sentence mastery in Marx, as with a supreme, dearly won, conquered savoir-faire, the agents of the sentence. The hierarchy and the subordinations of the sentence are replaced by the definitive discontinuity of the text, and what emerges is a form of writing that Barth describes as writing aloud. Quote, a text of pulsional incidents, the language lined with flesh, a text where we can hear the grain of the throat, a whole carnal stereophony. the articulation of the tongue, not the meaning of language. While I wonder about the reifying and potentially reessentializing idea of grain of the throat, as though each of us have one genetically essential and unalterable voice, the language here is otherwise remarkably evocative of Bad Brain's cultural work, and the larger frame of Afro-diasporic gap theory that I outlined at the beginning of this paper. Treating soul not as essence, but as instrument, certainly subverts the power of completion that Barth describes. Baba goes on to define his concept of the third space very much along these lines, and what's more, this passage gestures almost perfectly to Moten's analysis of black radical artists who find ways to live in the break between language and the speech act, as he describes it, but also the break between, as Barth puts it, theory and practice, language and politics. Or, as H.R. might put it, between thoughts and things. In my view, this is the gap for agentic voice. This is the third space, the non-dialectical middle, between objectivity and subjectivity, between structure and our place in it, between soul and craft. As H.R. croons on Voyage to Infinity, from the decks of his soul craft, quote, "At the port there'll be no double sign." Thank you.
Ooh,